Yeah, so thank you very much for having me here. And yeah, so just I would love to express my sincere congratulations with this absolutely beautiful and perfect conference. And this is my great pleasure to contribute with my really humble essay. So yeah, so today just I have a bunch of ideas, I would say. So it's not like, it's less scientific approach, rather essayistic view of how transformative reality we have now and how we deal with it. And yeah, so just a bunch of my ideas of how I see the combination of IT, digital sphere, and feministic approach on the way of, yeah, so dealing and investigating the reality that we're experiencing now. Yeah, and just I would like to preface my reading, and I'm so sorry, yes, I'm going to read because I'm not a very good speaker, so I hope that this essay is not going to be a lullaby for you, but still my apologies for that. So I would like to preface it with a quote from Timothy Morton, who is object-oriented theorist. So his ontology is somehow a continuation of Hartman's and Latour's ideas. And yeah, so this is the quote from All Art is Ecological, which is his book. So things are indirectly and constantly present. They only appear to be when they malfunction or are different versions of the same things than we used to. So at the moment when everything became shaky, fragile, broken, what used to be hidden under the thickness of the ordinariness and everydayness came out, became visible, tangible, and co-present. Paul Edwards, in the book Infrastructure and Modernity, Power, Time, and Social Organization in the History of Socio-Technical Systems, notes that for most technologies are invisible. Well-established technological systems are connective issues and blood vessels of modernity. In short, these systems have become infrastructures. So we are definitely on the verge of a grandiose change or a great failure. Systems are falling apart and connections are collapsing, the ground is falling out from under our feet, and perhaps a new stage of modernity will lead to a reconfiguration of the social and political fields, to new principles of freedom and connectivity of agents, or perhaps to an even greater integration of control and usurpation practices. And increasingly, we are seeing how soft tactics of resistance against harsh repressive systems allow us to achieve positive changes and maintain the horizon of a joint future, but there is still a place for human-sized conglomerations. Of particular interest is the question of how tech and feminist research optics analyze the ongoing socio-political transformations and what mechanisms and tools they see as transforming the space of cohabitation. The end of the 20th and the very beginning of the 21st centuries have become a vivid illustration of how new tools and mechanisms created by the digital space, among other things, lead to the development of fundamentally different forms of social institutions. In IT, technologies and tools can be an instrument not only for networking activism, reaction, creating platforms for solving current problems, but also for consolidation, subsequent changes in socio-political systems and their institutionalization. So a bunch of questions I would like to voice here. How do resistant tactics contribute to the gradual unwinding of the patriarchy machine? What role does IT technology play in this process, and how can we talk about a positive future together in a time of tragedies? And how does feministic optics represent the optimistic and pessimistic strategies of the future? And why it's important to have this convergence between tech and fem strategies of future transformations. And first of all, it's the possibility of new striking configurations of social and non-social relations, the transformations of power relations, the dismantling of hierarchical oppressive structures, and the possibility of going beyond the limits of organized monolithic environments. And together with Antonín Stibur, who is unfortunately not present here, but we approached the study of this topic in 2021 in a joint article, which we hope is going to be published soon. And in this article, we tried to show, firstly, how information technologies and more broadly digital systems determine the specifics, both in positive and negative sense, of Belarusian protests. And secondly, how do systems change or question traditional political or philosophical categories such as object, citizenship, state, borders, care, private and public spheres, agency, subject, whatsoever. The digital sphere plays and played at that time a significant role in Belarusian protest, and its potential is used to a much greater extent than it usually happens when protesters use social networks to quickly exchange information and organize events. Here, we analyzed not only the use of social networks, but also the creation of new IT products and platforms through which citizens so-called connect to the protest movement. Digital systems have proposed new organizational forms, horizontal, without hierarchies and leadership. The protest itself can be described as flickering and peripheral. As it was this horizontal format that opposed the rigid hierarchy of power and gave us a new sense of community in the horizon of the future. The Belarusian protests, like other protests, used IT tools to communicate and organize, quickly inform the participants of the resistance, but in relation to other situations, the IT potential, in our case, was embedded in the very logic of the movement, with largely determined the specifics and transformational power of the events that happened in 2020 and 2021. Within our approach that we maintain in the joint article together with Antonina, we analyzed the depth of IT penetration into the protest movement, which is reflected not only in the use of the power of social networks, but also in the development of complex infrastructure programs that allow organizing decentralized, distributed, flickering resistance. In the article, we've also noted that this feature of the protest movement became possible on the one hand due to the growth and development of IT within the country, and on the other hand, it's noted that the tandem protest technology became possible thanks to the network logic of both phenomena. In addition, in the text, we presented an analysis and research of those transformations and reconfigurations that became possible due to the widespread and not superficial use of technology in protest. Among them are the emergence of horizontal and complex, non-hierarchical forms of collective action, the creation of networks of solidarity and mutual support, the creation of alternative infrastructures, the practice of policies that seek to capture the horizon of the future, those policies that take into account the future. And these are the crucial, excuse me, these are the crucial aspects of that thing that unites together tech and fem strategies. So through the lenses of technologies incorporated into the social and political body, we can see the world differently. They may help us realize that the world can be composed in different ways, where both social and non-social chains and configurations interact, where human agents are equal to non-human agents, technical objects, and even other strange objects. IT can act as an interface for complex environments and newly appearing objects, or emergent objects if we talk in terms of Helga Novotny, for example. Such objects that arise at the junctions of interaction between different fields. Or, in the spirit of Agamben, may give birth to even more oppressive institutions. And Agamben outlines the generation of new invasive institutions interacting with bare life as forms of such pervasive control. For Agamben's subjective existence is determined not by the fact of the existence itself, reputation or publicity or any other social status, but by the fact of fixation of bioanthropometric data that are representative for management bodies and systems, whether it's going to be a polyclinic control and registration or airport inspection. As well as freedom of action, autonomy are independent variables in conditions of total control and subordination. In the biopolitical reality, the subject becomes subordinated to the element in the system of state care. His body is the intersection point of many discourses, socio-political practices of submission. But in the course of the Belarusian Revolution, we noted how technologies opened previously invisible channels of exchange, exposed and highlighted, one more time in a Agamben sense, the power that demonstrated the incapability of people, the power that turned a person into an animal capable of his own inability. And at the same time created a new utopian horizon of the future where other ways of cooperation and coexistence are possible. This ability to generate utopias makes technologies related to fem strategies one more time, which also generate radical images of utopias. There is a great variety of feministic optics. However, today I would like to turn to the theory of cyberfeminism, which among other things doesn't identify itself with an established theoretical trend, but rather associates itself with a diffuse, even parasitic one on the body of other theories, the socio-political body. So, for instance, Alla Mitrofanova identifies cyberfeminism with a browser for viewing and navigating in modern cultural shifts and historical heritage. One of the important strategies that activists use in the manifestation and production of new subjectivities and cultural femme representations in cyberspace, they contribute to the idea of utopia horizon. However, as the theorists of cyberfeminism themselves note, the insufficient interaction of theory and criticism also leads to negative effects and the reproduction of sexism and stereotypes of mass culture. From this perspective, the interviewing of social political theory and criticism will give more fruitful ideas for the strategies of net utopianism. So cyber-utopianism or web-utopianism or even digital utopianism or utopian internet is a subcategory of technological utopianism and the belief that online communication helps to create a decentralized, democratic and free society. The desired values may also be privacy and autonomy, freedom of expression, access to culture and information, were also socialist ideals leading to digital socialism. However, it's obvious that the digital environment doesn't automatically provide all the attractive value horizon, does not contribute to the decomposition of patriarchy and colonies, just as cyber-utopia does not automatically become an environment that releases identities, because it is also inscribed in the logic of social production, and it is a project of social environments, which of course does not ensure the freedom of gender, body, age, social class and race. The internet grows out of systems that have discussed wars and systems of violence, and at the moment are also the product of rigid hierarchical structures. This integration of the cyber environment, cyber utopia, into the mechanics of hierarchies at the same time sets the normative aspect of cyberfeminism as a strategy that produces a radical hybridization of the masculine patriarchal oppressive order. On the one hand, this can also be a vulnerable point of cyberfeminism or any other femme strategy that sees one of its tasks as the hybridization of the masculine world. Femme strategies can be in subordinate relationship when they act as fixators of errors of the dominant and determining system, when they find the expression in a didactic function, in the role of a corrector of dictations, consequences of masculine tactics, when they work on mistakes and try to embed the the marginalized vulnerable groups. And from this grows the fear that the femme episteme is devoid of heuristic potential, because this functionality is finite and has an auxiliary function. Thus, a certain radicalization and revolutionizing element is always needed. Thus, politically enlightened cyberfeminism, which takes into account the experience of past generations and critically comprehending the tools and strategies, has the opportunity to build a model of political thinking, among the tasks of which is deconstructing the patriarchal order that produces codes and languages and structures in the present, including in the web. The way we define femme strategies is, among other things, the modification of another, the search of another subjectivity, even and especially within those in whose emancipation the telescopes of the femme agenda are directed. The discovery of the other within oneself, the distancing and differentiation of this other subjectivity are the political tasks of both femme strategies and network connections and structures. The development of fragile ontologies and spontaneous agglomerations, sporadic associations, attention to microprocesses and micropolitics, switching from the policy of recognition, distinguishing from, to the policy of immersiveness and being with, are the distinctive features of those utopias that are possible in the horizon of technology and feminist strategies for the transformation of reality. And the more radically the task is formulated, the more clearly the outline of those dislocations and fractures that are characteristics of the actual social order emerges. And at the same time, we must not forget that any strategy or tactics has a dark side. Cyberfeminism has remained as an excellent project. Digital technologies and digital environments still remain in the status of potential for future changes. Subjects are still under pressure from power structures, and a catastrophic future is coming every day. However, there are much more opportunities to change everything. So thank you very much for your attention. Yeah, I would love to answer any questions if there are.
Since we're running a little bit late, I suggest you have a discussion a little bit later after all the three spokespersons are presenting their report. So just 1 second. Yeah, and right now we're inviting the next speaker, who is TANIA ARCIMOVICH. TANIA, as far as I can see, you are here, and I'm just going to share the screen. Okay, so a little bit of introductions, since we are dealing with technical difficulties. TANIA ARCIMOVICH is a scholar and a curator from Belarus. She's a PhD candidate at the International Center for the Study of Culture at UST University, Germany. And her topic is the Trajectories of Displacement, Non-Written and Lost Biographies. TANIA, have you already settled your presentation? Are you ready to speak?
One moment, because so maybe not able to record your screen until later. Sorry, because it's.
Do you have any needed permissions to share your screen? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, we can see your screen, and you can turn into the slide share mode. Yeah, great. Thank you. Welcome.
Hi everyone. Unfortunately, I don't see, but yeah, I hope that we are in touch at the moment. And thank you very much for this opportunity. Unfortunately, I could not join on site, but I tried to follow almost all papers, and thank you very much. And I want to present today some results of my research, which is a part of my dissertation project about the avant-gardes in Soviet Belarus I'm working on. I will present a historical perspective on the topic, however, unfolding the history of displacement, erasing, forgetting, and non-recognition of female producers in art, and defining some strategies of how it was performed, My paper aims to uncover some so-called universal common patterns of how this marginalization and as a result absent still happens, no matter in what field, art, science, technology, in any field which is considered automatically a male realm. And from this perspective, storytelling remains, as many feminist scholars argue, a fruitful contrast strategy to trouble this existing canon or structure in order to disclose its artificial constructivist character. Once I was talking with Belarusian art historian Olga Arkhipova, who before 2020 worked at the Belarusian National Art Museum and was responsible for biographies of artists whose works are in the museum's collection. I asked her if there were Belarusian female artists at the beginning of the 20th century. Many of them, Arkhipova responded, and I was surprised since usually the answer sounds like, no, not many, almost nobody. Then she told me how she reconstructed the biographies of these female artists. She looked for the details in the archives and libraries in Minsk, Moscow, Vilnius, Warsaw, other cities, those potential places where the traces of the artist from Belarus might be. Sometimes she succeeded. Sometimes the only name remains. So I will briefly share with you some of my preliminary consumptions regarding the role of storytelling and archives in revising and deconstructing the so-called structure. Since, as Griselda Pollock notes, quote, women had always been involved in the production of art, unquote. The question is why art history still belongs to men. You can see the photo from the Vitebsk People's Art School, history made in 1922. In many feminist art history studies, discovering photos is one of the favorite methods to begin a story, since it allows immediately to disclose the problematic points. Usually, we can see many women in photos from the history of different art movements, including avant-gardes. But the titles often present only well-known male names. The female figures remain with no names, and if they have, it tells nothing. Most readers might only suppose that she was a lover, a model, but definitely not a producer. Almost nobody usually asks, except for probably curious feminist scholars, who she was in fact. This photo is a bit of an exception, as it has an extended title. It is Robert Falk with his Vitebsk students, seated first row from left, Lev Zevin, Ivan Peskin, second row from left, Robert Falk, Raisa Idelson, Dmitry Morachev, third row from left, Efraim Volkonsky, Sarah Revinson, Moisha Kunin, Frida Rabkina. And not only female, but almost all these names, except for Falk and maybe Zevin, are mainly unknown. However, I suppose male figures still have more chances to be discovered, since the point is, would be these female figures are considered producers of art at all. At the same time, it was mainly female students who quantitatively dominated the Cubist and Suprematism classes in the People's Art School and represented the most ardent followers of so-called avant-garde arts. But only a few of them I at least mentioned, like Vera Yermolaeva and Nina Kogan as teachers and managers, or Ksenia Boguslavska and Elena Kabische Yakerson, since they were wives of Ivan Puvny and David Yakerson. Those who were students, and they were more than one-third of the whole number, almost disappeared from the school's history. And this example is one among those that show how art history can turn the phenomenon into an exclusively male achievement, ignoring and forgetting facts or leaving them as insignificant. You see the names of these students, but it is just a part of what is known. However, it already shows how representative the female part was. For instance, Evgenia Magaril, Chaya, Hanna, Kagan, Frida Rabkin, Elena Kabischer-Yakerson, Raisa Idelson had fascinating artistic biographies. Polina Hentova, she was not a student of the schools, however, she was born in Vitebsk. And she is mainly mentioned because El Lisitsky was unrequitedly in love with her. And as scholars suppose, it was the reason he came to Vitebsk and soon to Berlin following Hentova. She was born in Vitebsk, attended Penn schools, and then enrolled at the Academy of Art in Brussels. She lived in Paris and Munich and soon came to Moscow. In 1921, Hentova moved to Berlin and then to London, where she became a sufficiently successful artist. However, before she married the British artist Edmund Xavier Kapp. Nadia Khodasevich-Leger was born into a low-income family in one Belarusian village. At the beginning of the 1920s, she came to Smolensk to become a student of Władysław Sztymiński and Katarzyna Kobra. Then she moved to Warsaw, married the Polish artist Stanisław Grabowski, came to Paris, divorced. In 1950, she married the French artist Fernand Léger. The fact that I can mention these names and even tell at least a story underlines the privileged status of these women, although they are on the margins, but at least in history. The life paths of these lucky women were almost identical. Most of them were under the protection of male artists. Class and economic conditions are also significantly impacted. These women belonged to the middle class or artistic families, got a good education, including in the Western art academies, and could move to central cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kiev, Berlin, Paris, and other. The status of an artist wife, lover, and or class privilege were not obligatory, but required for women to enter artistic circles. After the Bolsheviks came to power, the situation changed, first of all, in terms of class. The privilege was to have worker or peasant roots. However, as the stories of Nadia Khodasevich-Leger and the sculptor Olga Dedok-Bembel show, despite the possible different roads for women from the periphery, a marriage or relations with a male artist remained a necessary condition to be mentioned in history. Thus, Nadia Khodasevich is mainly represented as an artist who associated with the names of male artists, a wife of Leger, a student of Malevich and Lev Sztymiński, and what about Kobra, as if it is the only way to value her art. At the same time, marriage status and so-called protection for male artists might not always mean a happy end for their professional ambitions. Olga Dedok dreamed of being, quote, no less than Leonardo da Vinci, unquote, and was one of those few women who graduated from the sculpture department at the Petrograd State Art Educational Studios, former Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg, at the end of the 1920s. She is known as the wife of the Belarusian sculptor Andrei Bembel. She is sometimes mentioned as a mother of Oleg Bembel, the philosopher and Soviet dissident, and rarely do art historians write about her as a sculptor. However, the more I look at these unknown names, the more I imagine how the landscape of art history could change if these stories are told. But despite a corpus of literature on the topic of women artists, which was published last decades, looking through the name lists in different publications and catalogs, it is obvious how incomparably few of women are presented. This number of about 10 tells us rather the story of an exception, as if the involvement of women in art was something atypical of the sex that merely reproduces, as Pollock states, quote, the idea that women and art are incompatible, unquote. It is a reason storytelling remains a fruitful approach for feminist scholarship. The problematic aspect is the scarcity of documents which allow even to reconstruct their biographies. In contrast to male artists, they often do not leave any record. Besides, artworks made by women often remain whether not attributed or missing as a result of different reasons, for example, like Great Purge or the Second World War or even Holocaust, when a lot of archives, private archives were banned, but also because misspellings, different name spellings, or mixed identification like Belarusian, Russian, Polish, French, and so on. For example, you can see different spelling for Nadia Khodasevich. And this list does not include Cyrillic spellings, or the version for Polina Hentova. Actually, officially, she's presented like Pola or Paulina Hentov. Jewish names were often adapted to the Russian version, like Haya, Anna, Hanna. And all these things make the process of discovery very complicated, and it should be taken into account. However, except for the numerous archival documents, for instance, Nadia Khadasevich left at least so-called memoirs written by another author, but based on her remembrances. Olga Didok also wrote the diary, but it was published only after her death, initiated and supported by family members. Who knows how many still not published notes are kept in family archives. Nevertheless, as Pollack underscores, analysis of private and such public documents as records, transcripts, registers, and so on should be done carefully, since it might, quote, not necessarily produce an alternative version, unquote. Besides, the archive should be considered, quote, part of a system of representation by means of which the past seems to be left deposited in the present, unquote. The aim is therefore to place, quote, this more extended range of historical materials in a theoretically informed framework of the social, economic, and ideological practices of the investigated period, unquote. At this point, archives, in a broader sense, function politically as a means of exclusion, but they can serve as a tool of inclusion as well. However, how to deal if there are no even recorded traces? For instance, you can see the only trace of the artist from the artist Palmira Mrachkovskaya is her portrait made by Yakov Kruger, a founder of the drawing school in Minsk in 1906. So she was an artist, a student of the school, a patron, but still there is the only her trace. And can this no trace mean something? How far can feminist approaches advance history? Do we need to move forward or entirely change the direction? And I want to finish my presentation with one more story, more current example. It is the artist Halina Rusak. Unfortunately, she died already. And Volga Arkhipova mentioned her name during our talk and said that there was an exhibition by Rusak at the National Museum in 1992. I didn't know her before. I started to Google, firstly in Belarusian. And I found this information briefly. She was born in Novogrudek, Belarusian artist, art critic, member of the Belarusian diaspora in the USSR, professor. After the Second World War, her family left Belarus. She graduated from Freiburg and Leuven universities. Since 1949, she has lived in the USSR. She received a master's degree in humanities from New Jersey University. She worked as the director of the art library of this university. Her works were well known in the USSR and Canada. She was a member of the leadership of the Association of Belarusian Artists and Craftsmen. And mainly her artistic activities in Belarusian are described in terms of her reference or service to Belarus as the motherland, like in this patriotic sense. And then I Googled it in English, and I found that she was an editor of the book titled Abstract Expressionist Women Painters, an annotated bibliography published by Scarecrow Press in 1995. Actually, she wrote a lot of reviews and analytical articles for Zapisy and Belarusian Study Journal during 16th, 17th. I found also an article in Wikipedia which presents Rusak as a member of the collective of the New York Art Gallery, Soho 20. This gallery was founded in 1973 by a group of women artists as one of the test galleries in Manhattan to showcase the work of female artists. Also, she participated in the exhibitions at the Douglas College Library, which pioneered the exhibitions of women artists' work. Linda Nochlin reviewed one exhibition, and I just read the fragment where she describes Rusak's work, actually. The impact of folk art inspiration is evident also in Halina Rusak's brilliantly colored biomorphic flowerscapes, although in this case, the folk tradition is that of the artist's native Eastern Europe. In both cases, the original sources of inspiration have been completely transformed by the artist in question and simply linger on as a kind of evocative visual memory trace in the new pictorial structure. In 1974, American artist Sylvia Sly created a diptych, Soho 20 Gallery, which contained portraits of the collective members of Soho 20 Gallery. I suppose Halina Rusak is that short woman in a gray shirt here with the red knuckles, who stands in the second row in the left pane, in my left. The Brooklyn Rail stated, it's also the information from Wikipedia, that the paintings could be, quote, read today like detailed history paintings that record the birth of the feminist art movement, unquote. And you see that digital tools, in my case, played a significant role to discover these alternative contexts. And I stop here. Thank you very much.
We are really grateful for your wonderful presentation, and as I've mentioned previously, we are now going to move to the next presentation, then have a joint discussion. And the next spokesperson is KSENIYA SHTALENKOVA. She's a lecturer in the Academic Department of Humanities and Arts and also in Science Shop Manager at the European Humanities University. And congratulations, KSENIYA, who defended in January her PhD dissertation in philosophy. So are you do you prefer to turn on your presentation by yourself, or should we share the screen here in the auditorium?
I can do that. I can do that. Thank you.
Anything that is more comfortable with you. So KSENIYA would talk with us about the role of woman narrator, the legality of choosing a plot in the years of crisis. Welcome, KSENIYA.
Thank you so much for this very, very nice presentation and introduction. And hello to everyone. I'm really happy to be presenting today, and I'm happy to be a participant of this conference. Please let me know if you can see my slides. Can you see it? Yeah, you can see. Okay, so yeah, as I think I misheard something. Someone was saying something.
I just said that everything is visible and is working properly, so you can just start.
Thank you so much. So yeah, as it was already mentioned, my presentation is titled Woman Narrator, the Legality of Choosing a Plot in the Years of Crisis. And except my academic career at European Humanities University, I'm also a writer and a playwright. So this topic was to some extent inspired by my professional interest in creative spheres and in creative writing, as in the year 2020, I switched from writing entertaining books for young adults in the genres of fantasy and detectives to rather dramatic stories dedicated to the history of Holocaust in Belarus. And during that period, I realized that I have no right to write some entertaining text anymore, and this is why I switched to more specific genres, which were really, which could be labeled as tragedies or dramas. And at the same time, I noticed that other writers, and specifically women writers, have almost the same problem as myself, and this is why I decided to outline a reflection, a rather academic reflection on this topic. So first things first, to define who is the narrator and who we can identify as the narrator, I think that At this point, we can refer to Umberto Eco's works in the Fictional Woods, which was published in 1994, and that's rather late, and that's rather structuralist, post-structuralist, and literary semiotics issue, but still it provides an interesting definition of narrators and readers, which might be of interest to this specific topic as well. So as for narrator, we can see this person as an empirical author, so as a physical person who is writing texts, and as well as a model author, which is rather a system of discursive strategies which build up the text. And corresponding to these two roles of narrator, or these two identities of narrator, we can see that the reader can be also identified as an empirical reader or as a physical reader, physical person who's reading this or that text, and as well as a model reader, which is a set of instructions which help to navigate through the text. And thus physical reader can become this model reader due to reaction and response to those instructions which were left by model author, which were also not only left, but specifically built up for that model reader who is of interest to model author. And as for this specific topic, of course, I'm mostly interested in narrators as women writers who are writing about other women. And in this situation, I think that it's also important to outline other key points which are important to discuss here, which is not only women's fiction writing, but also Belarusian context and political crisis of 2020-2023, which has a dramatic impact on what women's fiction writing is and how it develops within these years of crisis. So talking about the context before the year 2020, it's important to mention that gender aspect was of less importance for identifying oneself as a Belarusian writer, but the main challenge was the language, because most Belarusian writers community, I mean, the entire Belarusian writers community was split according to this definition, whether you are a Belarusian writing author or whether you are a Russian writing author. So Belarusian writing authors had publishing support, and they could get publishing support both from governmental and or independent organizations. But at the same time, their audience was rather narrow, or was considered as rather narrow, if comparing to Russian reading audience. And this Belarusian reading audience was also considered as intellectual because it corresponded to the ideals referring to cultural traditions and anticipations of how these traditions might develop in the future. And as for Russian writing authors, they had quite limited publishing opportunities in Belarus because many publishing houses in Belarus had policies aimed specifically at supporting Belarusian writing authors, and it was really problematic to get your book published if you used to write in Russian. And these authors were considered as cultural outlaws, and especially if they were published abroad, because they usually were considered as those writing for mass audience. And as for women narrators in 2015-2020, in this period, as I have already said, women's writing was considered as less important identity factor, but at the same time, interestingly, there were quite a number of successful stories of women writers, most likely over 40 years old, who covered the genres of historical nonfiction, fantasy, historical and realist fiction. And their books were quite often aimed at children, teenage, and young adults. And due to these successful stories, women writers under 30 years old got larger publishing support, and they also could have some mentor support on behalf of those successful women writers. And they also covered quite the same genres, also including romance and detective fiction. And that was also aimed at children, teenagers, and young adults, not only at grown-up audience. And as for the context after the year 2020, the situation was and still is that independent writers communities and publishing houses in Belarus are closed by authorities, and at the same time new publishing houses are established abroad, but there are less and less opportunities for Belarusian writers staying in Belarus to get published, because governmental publishing houses have their own queues and they have their own lists of writers. And this is why it's of real difficulty to get your book published or to find another opportunity for a showcase. At the same time, many writers are still relocating because of political repressions. I would say that this is not a new phenomenon to Belarusian writing community, because writers in exile were quite an issue during previous periods of Belarusian literature development, but still more writers are relocating and the number of those who are leaving the country increases. And what is the most dramatic thing in this situation is that Belarusians staying in Belarus and Belarusians going abroad for relocation mutually accuse each other of collaborationism or nostalgic hypocrisy. And this spring, there was a really scandalous situation during the book fair in Belarus, when those publishers who still were staying in Belarus and whose publishing houses were not closed by authorities, but they have not been closed yet, let's call it this way, and they participated in that book fair, but those publishers who went abroad accused them of collaborationism, and that also influenced not only the publishers community, not only writers community, but also readers communities, because the community was really split by the scandal, and it created a serious gap, which is difficult to overcome at this moment. And as for women narrators, after the year 2020, the gender aspect is still of less importance, because the challenge of what language to choose. I would say that not only gender aspect, but also language aspect is of less importance, because the previous challenge of what language to choose and where to publish in terms of governmental or independent organizations transformed into whom to publish for and whether to publish at all, while split geographically, politically, and psychologically. Because now we can see that reading audience, there are two reading audiences, one within Belarus and another one abroad. And the same is for the writers, for writing communities. And at the same time, this is the question of the showcase, because more and more Belarusian writers abroad get more opportunities for showcase, and they begin using different languages, but still this is the question of who will be reading the texts, because most likely it won't be aimed at Belarusian reader anymore. And as for the most considerable novels, which were widely and are still widely available in Belarus, there were two books published in 2020 and 2021. The first book is Pashtoidish VOLHA, written by Eva Vizhnoviets, and the second novel is by Tatiana Zimirovskaya, who published the book Smerti Net. And they both were written in immigration, and both books were written by those successful women writers over 40 years old, and they both are connecting the plots either to death or to family background in the framework of magic realism, as for Eva Vizhnoviets, or in the framework of sci-fi, as for Tatiana Zimirovskaya. And as for younger women writers, they mostly switched to autofiction, focusing on either sexuality or maternity or disability. And they often outline political repressions in Belarus or the war in the Ukraine as a subplot for their autofiction writing. And these texts are usually of shorter formats, and they are published in digital zines with narrow audiences. So in comparison to these books by Eva Vizhnoviets and Tatiana Zimirovskaya, they have less opportunities for the showcase, and they gain less attention on behalf of reading communities. So to sum up the current situation, it's important to outline that the notion of Belarusian literature and Belarusian writers' identities are at stake because of current political crisis. And that concerns not only women narrators, but any narrator who relates oneself to Belarusian literature or to Belarusian writers' communities. Most genres, except children's fairy tale books, have disappeared from the writing agenda, as this is really morally illegal. And this is quite similar to those accusations on social networks within Belarusian cultural communities as well, when some people really accuse each other of being happy during the times of crisis, during this political crisis, and during really dramatic situation, which is currently ongoing. And in this situation, it's morally illegal not only to write about something beyond the current situation, but it's also morally illegal to feel happy or to live a normal life. And what is more, this is really interesting that it's a problem not only to relate oneself to specific texts which are written, but it's also the problem of feeling the ability to write a text which has also psychological roots, because when you don't feel that you can express yourself and you have that freedom of expression to write any text which you could plan during previous periods of time, it's also the psychological pressure that you feel. And this is why writers feel that aphasia, as again Tatiana Zimirovska framed in one of her reflections, literary reflections, and this is a problematic issue as well. And as for specifically Belarusian women's writing in 2020, and I mean from 2020 to 2023, most writers are concentrating around either ancestry and or corporality, which is unfortunately limiting the diversity of identities among women fiction characters and also women narrators on both levels, not only on the level of model authors, but also on the level of empirical authors. And as for further perspectives which go beyond this presentation of mine, there are three main questions which are at stake to my mind, and I think it's really important to see what might come within those perspectives and along with these perspectives. Because first of all, this is the question of what are the ways to maintain or newly established Belarusian writing communities, and specifically those supporting women writing, encouraging the diversity among women narrators, both on the level of empirical authors and model authors. The second question concerns the current situation in the way that it is affecting readers' communities, and specifically on the level of model readers engaging in texts to maintain the future for Belarusian literature being relevant locally, nationally, and globally. Because although those concepts of Umberto Eco, of course, concern mostly the way that the texts are written and the ways that these texts can be read, it's also the problematics of finding a text relative to your experience so that you can engage in the text. Because if you cannot relate to yourself, you won't be, most likely you won't be reading this text. You won't be interested in identifying this text within your practical experience. And this is why this situation affects not only the practices which are shared by Belarusian communities among writers and specifically women writers, but also among readers' communities. And it also affects women readers, because fewer and fewer women and fewer girls of younger generation will be relating themselves to Belarusian literature. And the third question is, what are the risks of writers competing with AI development, able to generate plots, but having no gender, both globally and within Belarusian context? So, I mean, the risks, it's interesting to estimate the risks, both globally and within Belarusian context, because if referring to ChatGPT, which is really tremendously popular these days, it's a commonplace to think that it usually responds to the questions asking about their gender, that its gender, that it doesn't have any gender. And this is why it cannot produce or generate some specific experience perspective, and it can only analyze open data and some data which it has access to. And this is why it's a problematic issue. And at this point, I think it's really important to see how women writers, who were competing with men writers previously, will be or won't be competing with AI development, because this is again to the question of immaterial labor and the question of recognition of this labor and acknowledgement of those persons who engage in this labor. And it's interesting how ChatGPT, for example, or any other AI instrument might be used either for or instead the labor within writing communities, because at this point we see that it's really difficult to compete when some women writer is providing her experience perspective, and this will be some original, unique perspective, but still it might be of less interest to the reader, who might be looking for some more intriguing genres and some more intriguing plots, which will be artificially generated. But at the same time, as for Belarus, within Belarus, I think it's important to mention that ChatGPT is not available for Belarusians, and it's not available due to political restrictions. So maybe this won't affect those Belarusian women writers who are staying within Belarus, but still, I think that this is the interesting point to analyze anyway for future perspectives. At this point, I think I will finish my presentation. So thank you so much for your attention, and I will be happy to respond to any questions during the joint panel.